Good afternoon, good morning, folks, whichever time zone you guys are in. So we are ready to start our webinar today. This is our monthly webinars we do on topics related to software development, particularly around Agile practice. So the topic today is analysis in Agile. And this is a really good topic. We haven't covered this in our series so far. We often find in our work with Agile teams, that's a common challenge when a new team our team starts newly transition to Agile. This is a common challenge they struggle with, which is how much of analysis is appropriate. Too much starts feeling like waterfall, not enough starts feeling like chaos. And so how much analysis is appropriate to be done to do justice to the spirit of Agile. And in many of the trainings just conveniently assume that the development team has a nicely prioritized set of user stories to pick from and start development. So today we're going to shed some light onto how to think about analysis in Agile and how much is adequate analysis for the purposes of good Agile practice. And before I introduce the speaker, let me just cover quick logistics. We'll have just about 45 minutes or so of a presentation here. We'll take some questions along the way on this topic, and then we'll still have another 10 or 15 minutes at the end for general questions on this particular topic. So you guys should feel free to keep sending in your questions as the material gets covered. And at the end of the webinar, we'll have a recorded version available for those who registered and couldn't attend, and we'll also have the document available through our website. So with that, let me introduce our speaker. Our featured speaker today is Kent McDonald. Kent has literally written the book on this topic of analysis in Agile, and he, in his practice, he uncovers better ways of delivering value by doing it and helping others do it. His more than 15 years of experience include work in business analysis, strategic planning, project management, and product development in a variety of industries. And he is active in the business analysis and Agile software development communities, helping people share stories about what does and does not work. So, and you can see a lot of his work on the website listed here, Beyond Requirements. And he's also co-author of the book Stand Back and Deliver: Accelerating Business Agility, a book that delivers, that brings together immediately usable frameworks and step-by-step process that help organizations deliver business value and build competitive advantage. With that, over to you, Kent.
All right, thank you very much. And actually, to be technically true, I'm literally writing the book on analysis and Agile. It's, in fact, that's what I was doing before starting this webinar this morning, is going through
Excellent.
Some of the final drafts. So, out soon, I hope. All right, so today I want to talk about analysis in Agile, and the subtitle, it's more than just user stories. Kind of exists because a lot of times when I run into working with teams, especially from the standpoint of describing what it is we're trying to build, have a lot of discussion around what analysis really looks like and what it means from an Agile standpoint. A lot of times people kind of have the perception that it's just about writing user stories. Kind of want to spread the thought that it's not the whole story, certainly intended. And so I want to talk about kind of what are some additional ways that analysis looks like, and share some thoughts about the techniques that people have been using for a while, even before maybe they knew about Agile, are still appropriate. It's just a matter of how often you do them and when you do them and things of that nature. And I have this particular story here. Just it's kind of one of the examples I'll use throughout is my experience as the product owner for the Agile conference submission system. So I want to kind of set that up as well. And as I mentioned, one of the big questions I get when working with teams, and I do a lot of work with teams trying to improve their Agile practices or adopt Agile, and really specifically focus on that kind of that intersection of figuring out the right thing to build and describing it. A lot of people ask, what does analysis actually look like in Agile? And so that's going to kind of form the structure of the talk today, and I'm going to talk about three things that I think are very important when you're approaching analysis in an Agile setting or with an Agile mindset. And those are First, using value to determine the right thing to build, which this means is actually spinning things backwards in how some teams try to approach it. Then using some of those existing analysis techniques that people have used for a while to describe what to build. And then finally, take a little bit deeper dive into when folks say just enough, what does that mean from the standpoint of analysis? So let's go ahead and dive in and get started, talking first about using value to determine the right thing to build. And what I've seen and what teams doing when they adopt Agile, and again, it comes partly from the fact that a lot of the approaches kind of assume that, this approach is mostly focused on how to deliver the thing right. So it's a lot of development practices, a lot of that kind of thing. And there's just a big assumption that as far as coming up with what it is we're trying to build, that either the customers or this miraculous role called the product owner just knows inherently how to do that. And so the thought is that we get started up and we'll get together and we'll just brainstorm a list of things to do, and that'll really kind of solve all of our problems. And the trouble is that by starting with kind of just brainstorming a list of stories and just going from that, it tends to cause some problems of its own. A couple of which are these big ones that I've noticed here. The first one is that you're never quite sure whether you have a complete solution, and I'm not intending that to mean that it's extremely full featured and all of that types of things, but I'm even talking about there might be gaps in the things that are identified, because if you're just kicking out ideas and user stories, you're going to come up with a lot of things, but you may not have all of the necessarily really important holes plugged. So you could have the situation here where you have half a bridge, which in and of itself isn't terribly useful. The other thing, and ironic because it's almost the flip side of the scenario, is that you might end up getting something that looks a lot more like a wish list. And then oftentimes you have backlogs that really have both of these characteristics. So the wish list comes from, especially in teams that are just starting to use Agile, their stakeholders they're working for are used to being a situation where if I don't ask for something right up front, it's going to be a real pain to get it incorporated later. So I want to make sure that I'm going to ask for everything I can possibly think of. And so there's a lot of things on there that tend to be things that don't really directly add to the overall value, hence the idea of the wish list. A lot of backlogs I see as a result have both of these things. They have gaps, and at the same time, they have a lot of things that really don't lead to the overall outcome the teams are looking to get to. And one of the best ways I can think of to kind of counteract that is to actually start with the end in mind, thinking about what outcome are we trying to get to, and then decide what are the things we need to get there to actually deliver to get to that point. So that's where this idea of starting with value and then identifying the stories comes from. It's the premise that instead of brainstorming a big long list of stories and then going through and trying to assign value points or some sort of value to each story, which can be quite difficult because by the time you're getting stories broken down to a size they can be delivered in 2 weeks, it can be very difficult to assign how much value any particular story gives. The better value is to say, let's understand what the value is first. What outcome are we trying to accomplish? And then use that as a means of deciding which story should we be identifying to get us to that. So I'm going to talk about here how you do that in a broad sense, and in the next section I'll talk about how some existing analysis techniques can help make that even clearer. So the way to start doing this is to actually use goals and objectives to define what value means. So value in and of itself can be very subjective. It's kind of I know it when I see it. So you need to have some sort of tool to help you figure out when we talk about value, what is it we're meaning? And a good way I found of describing business value is that it actually helps an organization to meet the goals it's setting out to achieve. So let me give you an example. I live outside of Des Moines, and so I've had a lot of experience to work with a lot of financial services and insurance companies. And one of the things that one of the companies I worked with a while ago had a problem with is that they foresaw an increase in the number of claims coming in, but they didn't really want to increase the number of staff they had to process them. They weren't looking to get rid of anybody, but they certainly didn't want to dramatically increase the size of staff they had. And so they had a goal to increase their ability to handle expected increase in claims. This is a health insurance company. And at the same time, they realized that one of the problems they were running into was that a lot of their claims right now came in via paper. And so there was a bit of extra time involved in getting that set up so it could be incorporated into their claims processing system. So as a means of counteracting, of addressing that goal, they identified an objective. And here, again, the thought is if we have something measurable that we can check progress against, and use that as a means of saying, if we get to this particular objective, we know we've delivered some value. In this particular case, it's reducing the number of paper claims per week from 1,000 to 500. Also notice here I did a little bit of trick of project management as I established a date without indicating the year. So if things kind of go a little bit off the rails, you've never really nailed down specifically which year or which December 31st you're going to get this done in. I'm kind of kidding there. But what it is you've got a time-based objective here that you can say, we know when we're successful because we've been able to reduce the number of claims we get in a week from 1,000 to 500. Again, the premise is it's not that the overall number of claims is going to reduce, but that those claims have moved to more electronic form. Again, this is kind of a way of defining value, but in a way that's useful to the people working on the project to know, here's where we're being successful. The next step in the approach is to identify assumptions that we're making as far as, in order to reach this objective, there's certain assumptions we're coming up with that we believe will help us to get there. The key thing here is not only to identify assumptions, but also to note what they are and then remember them, because it's not just enough to identify what assumptions you're making, but you actually want to do something with that information going forward. So let's come up with 4 assumptions that might be relevant for this particular example. One of them is that we're assuming that most of the paper claims we get are from single doctors' offices. Again, being from Iowa, a lot of rural doctors, single doctors' offices probably haven't invested in their own systems, things of that nature. Again, also assuming that the reason that they're providing paper claims is they don't have their own medical billing systems that interact with the insurance claims. We do want to assume that doctors' offices do have internet access. It's kind of critical for our potential solution. And we have the assumption, the build it and they will come assumption. So in this case, it's that if we provided them some means of submitting claims online, that they'd actually use it. So these fairly significant assumptions that are leading towards the solution we're going to do, some of which, if we find out they're not true, could really blow a hole in the assumptions we're trying to make. So again, identify these assumptions up front, because again, remember, as you're starting an effort, starting a project, you're at the point of maximum ignorance. You know the least about it that you're ever going to know, because once you start doing building and research and talking to people, you're going to learn more. But when you're trying to plot things out and figure out what solution might you be going after, you know the least, but you need to make some assumptions in order to move forward. So the next thing you want to do is now you want to identify stories, but you don't want to just willy-nilly just start slamming a bunch of stories out there and saying we're going to do all of these things. Instead, what you want to do is to have it a little bit focused and say, let's make sure we're establishing stories, things that we're going to do that are either going to, one, help us to validate these assumptions we're making, especially those key ones that could really cause havoc if we don't get them right, and then gradually getting into stories that are meeting the objectives. So it's kind of the premise of learning and earning. So the first few things we're going to be doing is going to be doing a lot of work to learn. Are assumptions correct? What are the nature of the people we're working with? Things of that nature. And then gradually converting into, let's start getting some things built that are helping us reach those objectives, assuming the assumptions we made were valid. So how this would look like is, I picked a couple of assumptions. The one here is the majority of our paper claims come from single doctors' offices. So then we would maybe identify a story that says, in order to identify the main source of paper claims, Carol, the claims manager, and again, they go out and do some data analysis. We have that information based on, once things get in our system, we can take a look and see where they came from. And we can confirm that, yes, in fact, when we get paper claims, they tend to be from providers that seem to be in single doctors' offices. So do a little bit of work, some data analysis to confirm that is, in fact, true, so that we're going after the right audience, in effect. Helpful to do that earlier on so that we don't spend a lot of time putting a solution together that isn't appropriate and it isn't even attacking the right audience. The next thing we'd want to do is we want to actually have the assumption tested out that the build it and they will come. This is certainly an assumption we want to validate sooner rather than later, because this is the one that's probably going to be key to our entire solution. So for example here, kind of structured the same way, we go about doing something, and you'll notice that I kind of twisted the form of a user story around a little bit to put the why part first. And this pattern comes from Chris Matz, who said a lot of times if you do the typical as a some user role, I want to do something so that the value you're receiving, a lot of times the so that falls off. So if you're really concerned about it, it's helpful to put that why part first, and in terms of in order to. And then Gojko Adzik in his recent book, 50 Ways to Improve Your User Stories, I can't remember the exact title of the book, suggested a pattern that if you find you're working with stakeholders who tend to like the solution, one of the things you can do is have them term things in terms of the in order to and the as a, but leave the I need or the I want part blank and let the teams figure those things out. So I've done that thing here, and this is an opportunity for you to kind of think about what are some ways that you might go about validating this particular build it and they will come assumption. So what I'd like to do is give you a minute or two to think about how would you go about validating that if we built some way of allowing single doctor's offices to submit claims via a website, how could we validate that they would actually do that? So what I'd like you to do is think about it for a minute or two, and then write your ways to validate it in the questions box or the chats box. What are your thoughts as far as how you might go about validating those particular things? I'll give you a minute or two, and then we'll...
Can we take a question on this page?
Sure.
Also.
Yep.
So the way you define these stories in the yellow sticky note format. So these are stories not for building software, but these are stories for validating what to build.
Yep, these are kind of the first things you'd want to do to say before we launch down the route of building, there might be some work to do to validate some of our assumptions. The value of doing that first is we might save ourselves a lot of time and frustration by making sure we're tackling the right solution and potentially even tackling the right problem.
Okay, all right. Sounds good, thanks.
Mm-hmm. So again, if you have any thoughts as far as how you might go about validating that assumption that if we build it, they will come, put them in the chat window or the questions box. And I might need some help. If folks are putting things in the chat window, it doesn't look like I'm able to see them. So if you could read them out.
Yeah, so let me read. One of them is draw wireframes and show them to doctor's office folks and ask them.
Okay, so create some really low fidelity prototypes and ask our providers. Okay.
Right, exactly. Yeah. Let's see. That's the only one. Survey is another one. No.
Surveys. Okay. We'll give a few more seconds for anyone else to type in some thoughts.
Let's see. Another one says, I need to contact a sample of doctors' offices to get feedback if they would use it.
Okay, so contact a sample of the doctor's offices. Again, another kind of interview or maybe some focus group type things. Any more?
Another one is process walkthroughs. So I guess same thing, same idea, that you would actually go to doctor's office and walk them through the process and seek feedback, I guess.
Yep. So all great ways of gathering information. In fact, those are all very popular and very effective elicitation techniques that are good things to have in your toolkit. They happen to be described a lot in the analysis community. But they're not all necessarily the best way to validate those assumptions for the main reason that when you're talking to your stakeholders like that, there's a good chance they might be lying to you. Now, they're not lying to you intentionally and to be malicious, but there's a good chance that they might be telling you what they think you want to hear. So a very good way of validating that particular assumption is to build a very small version or something very similar, very lightweight version of a means of collecting information over the web, release it out there, and see if people actually use it. This is the idea that's kind of embodied with the concept of the minimum viable product in lean startup circles. And it's the idea that what's the smallest thing you can do to learn more about the problem and the solution that you're trying to satisfy. And by doing that, you're actually not only just hearing what they're saying they might do, but you're actually observing real action. And what they can actually do. So much more effective way, you're going to get a lot more confident in the results if you actually put something out there and try it. It could be as simple as we're going to mock up a Google form, and it may not be necessarily claims information, but something similar to see, are our providers actually going to go out and provide that information? So even though that the MVP idea, the minimum viable product concept, comes from lean startup, doesn't mean that those ideas certainly aren't still applicable in larger settings. It's just kind of thinking about what are some ways that we can get the most valuable feedback possible about the ideas we're trying to do and the assumptions we're trying to validate. All right, good deal. One of the tools that can be very helpful for kind of going through this process comes from Gojko Adzik. It's called impact mapping. And you can find out more about it at the website impactmapping.org. He also wrote a very good book on it called, cleverly enough, Impact Mapping. And the idea here is it's kind of taking a mix of mind mapping and a little bit of strategic planning to go through and think through what are all the various options that we could do to solve the particular problem. So the way it works, and this particular example is from Gojko's book, and it's for an online gaming company. And it starts off with a particular goal you're trying to satisfy. In this case, it's the gaming company's trying to get to 1 million players. And then you think about who are the people that can help us get closer to that goal, or who are the people that can prevent us from getting to that goal. And that's the next layer out. So in this case, it's represented by players, internal, or advertisers. It's basically, think of it as identifying actors, and it's answering the question who can help us get towards that goal. Then for each of those particular actors, you then identify what are some behaviors or what are some impacts that we want to see those people do. So what are some behaviors we want to see those folks adopt or change in order to help us get closer to that goal. So the interesting thing about this approach is that it focuses more so on people you're trying to impact and how you're trying to impact them before you even get towards thinking about what is it we're going to build to get there. So it's really looking at how can we impact behavior, how can we really drive a specific outcome. So for example, in this case, the players are current players, and some things that they can do to help us get closer to our goal are invite their friends, recommend it, or do some posting. And it's only after that that we then go back and identify, finally, what are some things that we as a team can do to provide them to help them drive those type of behavior changes. So the outward, these are the things over to the left. The items furthest to the left are what are known as deliverables, or these are the outputs effectively. So for example, in order to have our players invite their friends, we might be able to provide them some animated invite capability. Again, only identifying a variety of options that we can use to try and get to that goal once we've talked about who are we trying to impact and what impacts are we trying to get out of them. So it's really kind of driving things differently than from just immediately identifying what are all the deliverables we can make. Each of those hops then represents kind of an assumption we're making. So if you go along the path of players inviting friends using semi-invites, we're actually making a lot of assumptions there. One, we're making the assumption that current players would be willing to help us get more players there. We'd also making the assumption that players are be willing to invite their friends. We're also making the assumption that if we offered the capability of having some animated invites, that our current players would actually use it. So the way that this can be very powerful is you go through this process, you kind of pull the team together and do the impact mapping, identify all these options, and then you pick one particular thing that you're going to start off with, and you implement that particular change in isolation from everything else, and you implement it so that you can see the impact or the results it drives, basically without any other changes happening. And then that's a good way of validating, are those assumptions correct? And you can also see what's the ultimate impact on the final goal. Did it help us get to 1 million players? What you might find out is just by introducing semi-automated invites by itself, that gave us enough of a lift that we don't actually have to do anything else. We've already accomplished what we're doing. Boom, we're done. Or we might find, well, it kind of got us a little bit of a lift, but we got to go back and do some more. So you go back and think, okay, what's the next thing on the impact map that we think is the next best thing to do? So this is a way of kind of structuring that discussion to think about, we could populate the backlog with all of these items, but instead we're going to just take one of these and kind of blow that out and identify what are all the things we need to do to make this one thing happen, do that, deliver it, see the results, and then decide what do we do next. Really kind of turning that iterative approach and making sure we're going along the way, and at every step of the way checking to see, have we reached our goal or not, or do we need to move on to the next thing. So that's kind of encapsulate overall really the idea of putting value first and then deciding what to do based on that. All right. Next thing I want to talk about is describing what to build using models and stories. So this is the idea that we've identified, well, we think this one particular solution might be the way to go. Now we need to figure out how some way we can build a shared understanding of that with the whole team. It turns out that approaches that you've been using for quite a while can be very helpful. So if you've identified a solution, one of the best ways to start to say what are the very specific things we need to do is to actually model that solution out. And when I say models, what I'm talking about are things such as user interface prototypes, process flows. It might be a mock-up of a report or some sort. If you're into use cases, it could be a use case. These are all the different types of models I'm talking about. They're also known as requirements analysis techniques. Things that you would do, kind of work through to kind of understand what's the idea we're looking for. Now, although most of these are actually kind of computer generated, I like to have most of the models I use actually be hand-drawn, because the real power in using these models is in the creation of them when you're doing it collaboratively. That's getting together with your stakeholders, sketching things out, having conversations about what it is we're trying to accomplish. So you're building that shared understanding at the same time as you're drawing through and figuring out what it is we're trying to do. So the value in these isn't necessarily that they're no longer the sole communication means of describing what it is we're going to build. It's actually a means of talking through and getting a better understanding of the solution we're looking for. So when I say models, it's these types of things that I'm talking about. So you can, once you've used these models to kind of identify what is the solution, you can then use these models as a source to identify the stories that you're looking for. So this is an example from the submission system. It's one of the things that we do is people submit session ideas and then other folks can review them. So we might have gone through and sketched this out first to say here's kind of what we're looking for, and we say okay, now we need to kind of break this up into how we're going to actually do it. And so we would generate a set of stories that we could use as ways of kind of fleshing this thing out. So we use the model as kind of the big picture view to make sure we're focused in on here's the stories we actually need to do. And that implicitly means that we're not adding in stories that don't relate to this particular thing if this is the thing we're focused on right now. So in this case, we took this and we said the reviewer can add a review to a session, the submitter can view their review, and Reed can edit his review. So again, using the model as a way of providing some boundaries as far as what stories do we need to provide to kind of get away from the wish list thing to a little bit, but also making sure that we have something to go back to make sure we're getting a viable solution. To give you another example of this, I was working with an organization that was trying to do a website that they were using to provide information to their advisors. So the way we started out with this is we needed some way of kind of breaking the effort down into small chunks. So we took kind of modeled out, and this is actually their existing site, and we said, well, we want all of this functionality. It's going to look differently. But one of the things we did is said, well, we can break this up into bits so that we can deliver it bit by bit. But either one of those small chunks would still provide some value. So the first thing we did is well, we know right off the bat, so we want to give just an overall general listing of the funds that we have, which is represented by where the dotted line is now. Then, to kind of extend the capabilities of that, some other things we could do is kind of allow you to organize things based on the type of share they are, or filter by asset class, or viewing results either at the month end or quarterly, or you can be able to sort the table by various different characteristics. So those are different ways that you can go and say, generally we want to be able to see fund information, but there's additional ways we want to do about it, and those are capabilities you can gradually release out to see, do you have enough information now, and can you see it in a lot of different ways, or do you need a little bit more? And we can kind of mix those things in as we go along. Another thing that models are helpful for is if you are in a situation where you're going from an as-is situation to a to-be. So if you're supporting an existing business process and you're making changes to it, it can often be helpful to map out the process in the current state and future state first, then identify where the changes happen, and then the stories you identify are basically what do we need to do to get from current state to future state. So what we've got showing here is in 2013, when we redid the submission system, we also changed a little bit the process going about how things are submitted. We added another piece of information that we wanted to use for kind of organizing our sessions. So for the conference, we usually get in around 1,100 session submissions, and we have to pick about 240 of those. So dealing with 1,100 and having a committee of around 100 people, we're looking through them, it's helpful to kind of organize things into groups. So we had the idea of 15 topic-based tracks, such as leadership, development practices, coaching and mentoring, things of that nature. But we found that even 15 tended to be kind of a little bit too hard to manage. So we wanted to group those 15 tracks into one of 3 themes. So this process here is showing the change from before and after, where we're wanting the submitters to identify the theme and then pick the track within that theme. So as you can see, this is the particular change in the process that happened, and we created a story in order to count for that. So in this case, I want to organize tracks into themes. So as product owner, conveyed this to Brandon and Darren, who were the team, if you will, the developers that were working on it. And so as I was describing things to Brandon, one of the things that he kind of pointed out, and see, he also had the advantage of having a bit of experience in the process. One of the things I really like from working with Brandon is he's very good at making sure, and the way I put it is he's a developer that thinks a lot like an analyst, especially because of that last sentence there in his quote. What problem are we really solving with the theme concept? So he's reminding me as a product owner to think back and always think about why it is we're doing it. And so I had to explain, well, you know, it's really we want to kind of we want to kind of group things together so we can keep it simple. So it wasn't a matter so much that we should really expect the submitter to know theme and then track. We just need to be able to get them to identify generally what this thing is and then have it grouped kind of that way. So by describing that a little bit further, Darren, the developer, then just said, oh, well, I know how we can do this. Boom, it turns out that, and this was a capability I didn't know was there, is that we can have kind of hierarchical drop-down lists. So basically, we still have the submitter pick just the track, and then it automatically gets grouped into the appropriate theme, as this is here. So this kind of is a sample case to explain why, when you're dealing with stories, you really want to keep it at the level of why are we trying to do something, and let the folks that know the capabilities of the technology the best come up with solutions based on that, because generally they're going to come up something that's probably very simple and yet very elegant and satisfies the thing, as opposed to trying to explicitly describe the solution that needs to happen. So even though I'm a big proponent of that, it's always good to have a reminder from the people you're working for to always kind of have that thought process in mind. And this is, again, where models can be helpful, because the sketching things out like this really helped facilitate the discussion about, oh yeah, this is a great solution. The other place where models can come in handy is they can actually provide further information to the stories. So as I mentioned before, stories aren't, again, the complete story, and as a lot of teams have found out, user stories in and of themselves are not sufficient to fully describe the solution, and they never were intended to be. They were really intended to be placeholders for more conversation. So you need some further information to be able to describe them further. The trick here is you want to do it in a manner that doesn't seem overwhelming. And because of the things I'm going to be talking about next, I don't get too hung up too much on how the story itself is written, as long as the people involved in the team kind of get an idea of, oh, this is what we're talking about. And that's because I like to further describe stories as you're getting closer to developing them using one or more of three things, either models, acceptance criteria, or examples. And I'm going to kind of describe how those things work here. So the first one is models. So we've got, as read the reviewer, I can add a review to a session so I can provide feedback to Sam. And one of the ways to provide a bit more information about that is the model. Now, in a lot of cases, the model you use here is probably going to be the one you use to identify the stories in the first place. But the good news is it provides a lot of information. Again, a picture can be worth 1,000 words to kind of further describe out what it is we're talking about here. And you're doing it still in a fairly simple, straightforward manner so you don't have to spend a lot of time and document a lot of things. This is stuff that you already had. So some of my favorite modeling tools include a whiteboard, dry erase markers, and a camera to snap pictures if we need to. So this is, again, a good way for models to describe stories. You're not going to necessarily have a one-to-one relationship where every story has one model. And in a lot of cases, you've got a model can refer to multiple stories. Next thing I use to describe stories in a bit more detail are acceptance criteria. And the way I use these are to kind of supplement the other two means. So either if there's something that either the model itself, like a prototype or wireframe, or examples, which I'll show in a second, don't really support things, I can add in acceptance criteria that are kind of end up being very explicit statements about what it is we're trying to accomplish. So for this, in this particular case here, it's things such as required fields, maybe if a particular field is limited to certain characters, things like that. And the nature of what your acceptance criteria entails is usually something that the team itself kind of decides is what feels appropriate for them. And then finally, a way of kind of conveying a little bit more information about behavior of the system is what I like to refer to as examples. And these have come out a lot lately of ways of kind of further describing the behavior system. It's a technique that's used quite a bit as part of behavior-driven development. It's also a great way to further describe and explain what it is you're trying to build here. And it's a great conversation tool because you can have conversations about, okay, what happens in this particular situation? Well, given these are the state that the system is in when I do this, then this is how I would expect the system to react. So you can have those conversations, you can record that information, and these can be very easily turned into automated tests. So what I'm showing here is an actual screenshot from GitHub, which is the source control tool that we use for the submission system, and all of the features that we have in the submission system are backed by automated tests built off of these things. So we use Cucumber, and we use this structure, which is known as Gherkin. So I'm going to skip that. So that's kind of describing what to build using models and stories. And again, the extent and the nature of which of those three you use kind of really depends on the team and how they are used to working with each other. And I'm going to talk about next about one of the ways you can have the team kind of identify what works best for us as a way of further fleshing things out and describing things. And that is
Can
how
we
to
take
determine
one
which
question?
stuff. Yes.
So the analysis that you just went through, the examples and the ways of doing it, who does that? Is that largely a product owner doing it in consultation or discussion with stakeholders, or is the rest of the team in some way also involved in this exercise?
So what I usually find with teams is that there's someone that's kind of taking the lead on figuring these things out. Might be a product owner, might be an analyst that's working and supporting the product owner. But for these to be very effective, you certainly need to incorporate involvement of the rest of the team as well, especially if you can get perspectives from a development and a testing standpoint. And so there's a technique that's called the Three Amigos, and I'll talk a little bit more about it a little bit later, where you get people from the business, from the tech, from a development, and from a testing perspective, all looking at stories together and saying, have we got all the examples fleshed out? So what you usually see happen is that maybe about 80% of the time it's product owner, analyst type folks working on these things, but they're bringing in developers and testers, and so they're spending about 20%. And I'll show this a little bit more here coming up, but great question. Certainly someone's kind of working ahead a little bit to get those things kind of identified, but certainly want to have members from the different perspectives looking at it to make sure we get it fully fleshed out.
All right, sounds good. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. So there's a few aspects to doing just enough. And the first part of this is to do only what you actually need to do. So mentioned earlier that one of the things you could do is go through and identify some models and sketch things out. Now for the submission system, it turned out the team that was working on it all had a lot of experience with the actual submission process. And so any of the models that are referring to the submission system here, we didn't actually do them when we were building the submission system. These are things I actually drew specifically for this presentation. And that was because we all had fairly good built-up domain knowledge and could just talk through things and refer to the system we were replacing. That's not always the case. So in some projects, you're going to find that you do need to do some of these things to make sure you're helping to supplant that shared understanding. But one of the things I encourage teams to do is not immediately assume they ought to do all these things. Just figure out what's the right things that we need to do and actually only do those particular things. So don't do a model just for the sake of doing a model. Do it when it helps to build a shared understanding and helps to clarify things for everybody. One of the ways to figure out what really are the needed things to do is to establish a definition of ready. In a lot of cases, what this is basically, when are we done with analysis for this particular story? The way it works, and it's very similar to the idea of definition of done, and it's an agreement amongst the team that says, here are the things that we would expect to have in place to consider a story ready to start bringing into an iteration or to start development work on. So it starts off by the team getting together and agreeing, here are the pieces of information we want to have in place to get things started. And a lot of times when I'm working through teams, what I do is I basically say, okay, what are all the things you'd like to have before you get started? And they start generating a lot of ideas. Again, these are teams that are just moving from Agile to a bit more of a prescriptive process with a little bit more phase-based approach, and they'll generate a lot of different ideas like that. And so as they start getting through there, then they start looking at it and say, you know, that seems like an awful lot of stuff to do every 2 weeks for every user story. I said, yeah, it typically does. What we usually end up resting on is this kind of a list of stuff. So it's effectively coming into a sprint, coming into an iteration. What we like to see are a story that's small enough, the things I've identified, so the models, the testable examples, and acceptance criteria. And then other things that can be helpful are, do we know what stakeholders are interested in this particular story? Because those are the folks we're going to want to demo it to when we're done. And do we know of any dependencies that exist between this story and any other thing? So again, each team's definition of ready might be a little bit different. If you're in an enterprise type situation where you've got some outside teams that you rely on to do things, some of those types of activities like database changes and things like that might end up becoming part of your definition of ready, because you got to get those things lined up before you can get in and moving things. But it's not something that's written in stone that can't be changed. But it's just a general agreement amongst the team that says, as of right now, here are the things that we'd like to have in place in order to get started on a particular story. The next thing is to analyze when you need to, not before. And so I'm going to talk, I've been mentioning here about doing a little bit of analysis up front, and the way that this isn't just reverting back to waterfall where you do all your analysis up front, I'm talking about is getting a breadth-wise understanding at first to say, here's the general breadth of what we're trying to do, but we're not going to do a deep dive into anything until we get really close to delivering it. And only then we're going to just do a deep dive into that sliver so that we can use learning by going through the entire process to influence how we analyze the next part. And it also prevents us from doing analysis on things we may not end up delivering at all. And one of the ways that I have found very helpful to kind of support that type of activity is to actually visualize not only the delivery process, which is a board that you may be very familiar with that a lot of teams have used, where it's actually tracking things in the process of developing and testing, but then also visualizing where things are in terms of backlog refinement. So how are we doing on getting things ready, as it were? And that's and I use what I refer to as a discovery board for that. It's basically let's see where things are progressing in terms of getting them ready to go. So let's dive into this discovery board a little bit more here. And this is a sample discovery board that I worked with one team on, and they needed to visualize their backlog refinement process, so they could give a lot of people a heads-up idea on what things were coming next, and also to give their product management area an idea of, hey, we're needing some more meatier stuff that we're working with here. So the way it works out is we have each column, and in each column you kind of identify these are the criteria you need in order to be in here. So their first one is that when stories just started and we just came up with these ideas, they'd be in this new column. Then they tended to want to size things fairly early on. So they would move things over to ready to estimate when they had a story and they'd identified a couple of very high-level acceptance criteria, so at least they knew enough to know generally what's this story about. Then they would take this board, it was on a magnetic whiteboard on wheels, they'd wheel it into where they were doing their sizing discussion and use that ready to estimate column as their agenda for the sizing discussion. So once things were sized, they'd move them over to the estimated column, and again, in order to be in there, you needed to have the story, acceptance criteria, and size. And then finally, their column, as far as this one's ready to go, ready to be considered for iteration planning, was called ready to rock. And so this is where the definition of ready comes into play. Effectively, in order to be in the ready to rock column, it needed to have all those characteristics that I mentioned earlier as part of the definition of ready. So it's effectively when there were stories in that estimated column, that would be the key to the members of the team that were focusing mostly on the discovery activity, that they needed to kick it in and make sure they had a full description of what it was they were doing. It was also going from estimated to ready to rock that they would decide, okay, this particular story would be helpful to do a Three Amigos discussion on. So you'd call over a developer and a tester and say, hey, can you take a look at this and make sure we've got everything covered? So that kind of covers the main things I wanted to talk about. One of the ways I like to go about getting some feedback is if anyone happens to be on Twitter, if you could say there was something useful I found in this particular session, if you could just tweet me back, and I got a sample tweet here that you could use. Any of these techniques you found useful, you might want to give them a try. Just tweet it out. Let me know what you found useful. All right.
Excellent. So I think this is the point at which we pause for questions, right, Kent?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, excellent. So, well, thank you so much, Kent. So far, we will bring you back as we take more questions. There are already some in the queue, and I would encourage all the audience to keep sending in their questions. And while you're doing that, I'll just take a couple minutes to introduce Synerzip, or not a couple, 30 seconds probably. So if you can, Kent, advance this page so I can do a quick introduction to Synerzip while we're collecting the questions. So those of you in the audience who don't know Synerzip, we are a product development partner, and emphasis in the spirit of Agile is in the partner word for small to mid-sized, typically venture-backed growth stage technology companies, and we help them by assigning a team that works with them as an extension of the in-house team and does ongoing product development work. And given our expertise in Agile development and general software practices, we are able to reduce the risk that is inherent in delivering valuable software, and while doing that also reduce the cost that our clients have to invest. We have a dual shore team. We have a development center in India and a team on the US and Silicon Valley side, and that having that dual shore team allows us to both reduce the risk and the cost. And doing all that, we are still able to provide significant flexibility to our clients who, while working with us, at some point decide to convert the team into their captive team. So that's called the BOT, build, operate, transfer options. We provide that flexibility as a partner to our clients. So that's what we do as a company. We've been at it for about a little over 10 years now. And if you can go to the next page, Kent, that just gives a little glimpse of some of our clients. Most of them are, as you see, some few large companies, but mostly small to mid-sized venture-backed software companies. And that's enough of Synerzip overview. Feel free to reach out to us. With that, let's go. Actually, let me put a plug in for the next month's webinar. So next month's webinar is this topic of lean with mean, which is an interesting play on words. So the idea is, how do you use the mean, MongoDB, Express, Angular, and Node as a technology stack for building software following lean startup techniques of rapid cycles of experimentation and feedback. So we'll cover that in next month's webinars. So register for that. That's on May 20th. And with that, let's come back to taking some questions. If you're ready, I have a fairly good list of questions. We'll go to. So the first one, this take is related to the, essentially, I'll read off the question, but it relates to the role. So if your product owner is challenged and just cannot understand how to develop a story and there's no BA available, should the Scrum Master ever do this? So let's generalize the question again. So maybe you can shed some light on who does this, and along with that, shed light on that nomenclature of for the product owner versus the BA and so on, and who should do it, and should a Scrum Master ever take on this role of analysis?
Yep. So there's a lot packed into that question. So I'm gonna kind of take it from the perspective of the way the roles were intended, or at least my interpretation of the way the roles were intended. So Scrum started off by saying de-emphasizing roles overall, so basically saying that we're going to identify three basic main things that need to happen. You've got the product owner, which my interpretation of it really is this is the person that is responsible for making sure decisions are happening about what the outcome is we're looking for. So from the business standpoint. Now, they might be the one that is in a position to be able to make those decisions. In a lot of the teams I work with, it tends to be there's a lot of people that want to have a say in those decisions, so the person playing that product owner role ends up kind of facilitating the decision making to happen. But certainly that. The Scrum Master role is really there to provide facilitation and obstacle removal, and they're kind of the process guardian, but they're the process guardian from the perspective of the team decided this is what we're going to do. The Scrum Master is there to hold a mirror up saying, you guys said you wanted to do this, are you really doing those things? And then there's the team, which is basically these are the folks that are doing the work necessary to deliver the value looking for, to put the output out there that's going to get us to the outcome we're looking for. A lot of thought in the Scrum community and Agile overall that coach and that product owner role probably shouldn't be the same person, simply because one of the main things that the Scrum Master is also looking to do is how's the product owner working with the team, and are those things working well? And if you've got someone that's kind of being the guardian of the process and also is there kind of being the shepherd of the outcome, that can very easily turn into a case where they're kind of converting more to command and control of not giving that proper balance to are we building the right thing versus are we building the thing fast versus are we building the thing right. Now, with that said, if you have a product owner that's struggling, it depends on where they're struggling. If the product owner is struggling making decisions that are going to stick and providing clear idea of what outcome you're looking for, chances are you got the wrong product owner. And you need to find someone that's able to make those decisions, provide that guidance. If it's more along the lines of that the product owner does have kind of a clear idea of where they're heading, but they're just not familiar, don't have a lot of experience with the mechanics of breaking things up into smaller stories, or don't have a lot of those analysis toolkits, certainly someone else on the team can be providing that support, and it might be the person that's filling the Scrum Master role because they've got experience doing that. In that case, there's nothing necessarily wrong with that. It's when the Scrum Master starts moving into making the decisions that really should be coming from what is the outcome, and that kind of melds. That's when you get into a type of a problem. So as far as who should be doing this type of work, it's whoever has those skills and who's done it before can be doing it. In a lot of cases, what I find is that analysts that are involved certainly do that, but then they're also there to help coach the others on the team to get better at it as well. Because one of the things you don't want to have in an Agile setting is a lot of work hoarding, where some people say, hey, I'm the only one that can do analysis because I was an analyst before.
Thanks, Kent. Let's take second question. That also is going to be, I'm going to read off the question, then I'll amplify it, combining a few other questions with it. So so this is if we can't identify all the stories, how to forecast delivering business value in each release. So not being able to lay out all the stories up front. So let's say you're starting a new development cycle or new development for a new product, and there is a certain kind of a budget or investment that is called for. So there's a scope that needs to be managed, obviously. Now, doing analysis for each and every part. You got to only analyze certain parts of it which are high value and get you to MVP, or the example of a bridge you were showing, it has to have just enough complete functionality to achieve the business value.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you decide what not to analyze and what to analyze until you have the whole thing? Or is that
Yep.
how do you deal with the situation?
So I'm going to answer that with a story. So with the submission system, actually the first year we had it where we had to rebuild it, and then going forward where we were kind of more in a maintenance enhancement mode. We were definitely working under, if anything else, we had definite time constraints because we needed to get the submission system up and running by a certain time so that we could start accepting submissions in order to have the conference. So there's a definite time frame, very clear business motivated time frame. So what we did is we used that as a definite constraint that says we know we got to have something available, and it was basically by backing up. Here's when the conference is. Here's when we usually like to have the program identified. Here's how long the process takes to pick the session. So we need to have something that's going to accept sessions by December 1st. And we were starting in mid-October. So we knew that we had from mid-October to December 1st to get something done. And so we said and in this case it was, what's the minimum viable thing we need to have by December 1st to keep moving forward? And at that point it was, we needed to have something that could accept submissions and something that could allow people to start reviewing it. And so we used that as our decision filter that helped us say, okay, here's the stuff we're going to bring in, here's the stuff we are not going to worry about right now. And so by that particular approach, we used the time and date constraints we had, and then also our and at that point we didn't have a good feel for how much we could get done, although Brandon and Darren had worked quite a while together, so they kind of had a feel for it. And we basically said, what are the things we absolutely need to have in order for that time frame? And then as we got closer, we could adjust to say, well, are we making progress to getting those things delivered, or are we going to be cutting it short? And in which case, what we would do is we basically, the things we would leave out would be stuff dealing with scenarios that would happen less frequently. So we did have the basic things that would happen, cover the 80%, the 20% of things that would basically deal with 80% of the situations. Then after that part, we basically said, okay, what's the next set of things we need to bring in there? So it's a matter of identifying what are the real constraints that you have to you, and say, what are the things we need to make sure are absolutely in there. And it often means that you're leaving a lot out, but oftentimes those things you're leaving out really don't contribute to the end result anyway. And then if you're in a situation where you have a deal where you're trying to reach a particular objective, you can introduce those things, see how you're doing based on getting to those objectives, and then say, are we there yet? Are we done, or do we need to keep doing some things in addition? So it's really taking the idea that if by iteratively delivering things, getting feedback, you can then respond, and it's not, you are then not necessarily beholden to having to lay everything out. You might have kind of the big chunks of what you think you'd like to do identified, but what you're doing is you're focusing in on using these decision filters, as I mentioned, to say what's the most important thing to focus in on this next month, this next 3 months, what have you. And it could be, what are these big assumptions we got to validate, or what are the functionality that we have to deliver?
Great, thanks. Let's take another question which is a little more general, but I'll read it off also. How to identify complexity of a requirement and how to decompose.
Okay.
Advice?
Yeah, so I think in this particular case, I'm going to relate this back to story splitting. And so one of the things I've been helping teams out with lately is it's fairly easy to identify the big chunks that are meaningful to your stakeholders. But when you start trying to take those things and trying to figure out, okay, how are we going to break this down into small chunks that we can get as a quick feedback cycle and get them done in 2 weeks or less, kind of comes problematic. And so one of the things I've done to help teams out with that is I've pulled together a list of 21 story splitting patterns, and there is a plethora of posts and resources on the internet of different ways of splitting stories, and they're all about different ways of thinking about how can we break this into smaller chunks but still keep them at some sort of valuable thing. And so what I do a lot is I'll work with teams to say, okay, what's the situation you have? Okay, so we've got this particular thing we're trying to introduce. What are some of the ways we can break it out? So some of the most common patterns I use, one of them was actually kind of referenced in here as far as we want to create some type of entity, we want to be able to edit it, we want to be able to update, view it, we want to be able to delete it. Another common thing is to say, and I mentioned this also earlier, is oftentimes when you're introducing new functionality, it reacts a little bit differently under different scenarios. And so if you have something along those lines, what you do is say, what's the most common scenario? And we're going to satisfy that one first. And then we're going to break off the things that there are these other scenarios that maybe aren't as common. We're going to deliver those later on. And we might find that we don't need to address those at all, that they happen so infrequently, it just makes sense more to be kind of an exception handling type thing. And then another common thing is that oftentimes there are a lot of business rules that are involved with something. You can often deliver just some kind of core functionality and then add some rules onto it later on. One quick way to identify if something is very complex is to look at how many acceptance criteria or how many examples you've identified for that particular thing. And if you have a long list, that's usually a good indication that maybe we should split this into smaller chunks where different parts of this are actually addressing different aspects of those acceptance criteria.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Kent. I think we run through the time limit. There are a few more questions, but I guess we just have to hold off on that. And so I'll let you kind of wrap up. And thanks everybody for attending today. So back to you, Kent.
Okay. So just a couple things. If you remember nothing else from the last hour, remember to always start with value to determine the right thing to build. So what outcome are we looking for? Models, acceptance criteria, and examples are great ways of describing the solution in conjunction with user stories. And it's really a team effort and a collaboration to figure out what is just enough. So if you found this stuff interesting, here's my contact information. If you have any other questions, feel free to drop me an email. Again, my Twitter handle is at BeyondRex, and there's other writings at beyondrequirements.com. You can get an earlier version of this talk from SlideShare, and I also believe that this particular set will be available from the CenterZip. And then the book pictured there is the one I'm furiously working on right now that's due out later this summer. So thanks very much.
Excellent. Thank you all for attending, and thanks again, Ken, for giving a great deep dive on this topic of analysis. Look forward to seeing you all next month.